You're a guy whose life is going wrong. Your only comfort is video games. However, one day you find yourself immersed in a virtual reality game where if you die, you'll suffer consequences in the real world. And yes, folks, I also want to know what it's all about. The anime begins by telling us that in this story, many gaming companies created various virtual reality worlds massively. Among them, there was one made with artificial intelligence that got a bit out of control. In fact, it got so out of control that it was banned, so the new games based on artificial intelligence were replaced again by classic old games. In this context, we meet our protagonist named Yuki, who for the moment leads a normal life in his school, or well, not so normal, as we see that he has a teacher who serves as his advisor, but from his attitude, we can tell that he's the one who needs advice. That teacher is crazy. The protagonist, noticing that his teacher is a bit nuts, decides to go home. On the way, he meets a classmate who invites him to play on the court, but he declines. Then he encounters some bullies who offer him protection in exchange for money. Our protagonist pays them and continues on his way. Later on, he goes to buy a game, but not just any game. This game is being released for the first time, and the protagonist has been waiting for it for a long time. The problem is that when he goes to pay, he remembers that he gave money to the bullies, so now he's short 1,000 yen to complete the price. For this reason, he had to leave the store without his coveted game. However, the guy doesn't give up yet, so he goes to another store to see if he can get it cheaper. When he asks the waifu attending, she gets up as if offended. Truth is, this girl is weird. She even starts scolding her customer, who is the protagonist, for playing so many games and pretending to want a game that's barely being released. Naturally, the guy reacts as he should. He stands up to her, telling her that he doesn't have to receive scolding from a store employee. Just when he's about to leave offended, the waifu grabs his arm and changes her attitude. Now she shows her sexy version and tells the protagonist that she has the game, and cheaper too, so well, in the end, the guy can buy it. But the waifu deceived him because it turns out that the game she sold him wasn't the one he wanted. When the guy wants to ask for a refund, the girl tells him that returns are not accepted. This waifu is a daughter of a fruit. They're also the waifu, seeing that the guy is unhappy, and yes, it's understandable. She just scammed him in the face, tries to convince the protagonist that this game is better than the one he wanted to buy. She tells him that this game she sold him is a full drive RPG for adults. And yes, she sold it to him even though the guy is 17 years old. Finally, the waifu introduces herself as Riona and tells the protagonist that she would be willing to play with him if he takes the game. With this, she managed to convince the guy to take the game. When Yuki gets home, the first thing he does is try the game, and folks, he's quite surprised to see that his character is identical to him, and also everything he experiences in the game, he can feel as if he were really transported to that place. There he meets a waifu named Alicia who introduces herself as the protagonist's childhood friend, and then a guy named Martin who introduces himself as the protagonist's best friend. Then the protagonist remembers that his first mission in the game is to go to a city called Flora, but when he's about to leave, Martin stops him, saying that it's very dangerous because after a Globans invasion, the residents of the city where the protagonist is were forbidden to leave. The guy obviously doesn't intend to heed the warning, since after all, it's just a game, and in games, you have to face opponents, which in this case would be those Globans. However, Martin says he won't let him out because he doesn't want him to die. There, the protagonist understands that the game will force him to fight against Martin to serve as a kind of tutorial. The detail is that the guy gets beaten up. While lying on the floor, he begins to remember that his life is already sad enough for him to be defeated in a game too. So with that anger, he faces Martin, knocks him down, and accidentally kills him. On her part, Alicia, after seeing her brother Martin's death at the hands of the protagonist, wants to kill him, so he runs out of the cabin. After a while of running away, the guy manages to lose Alicia and is nervous because he says he killed a person, although well, aside from everything seeming real, the truth is that it's a game, so the guy considers restarting it to avoid feeling the way he's feeling. Then Riona appears, who far from being human, turns out to be a fairy in that game, and her mission is to support other players. There, the protagonist tells her that he thinks he made a wrong decision. Riona tells him not to worry, that there's always a chance to turn things around. However, when she checks his necklace, she realizes that the protagonist has been identified as a best friend killer, so now he'll have a hard time in the game. Chapter 2. Furthermore, Riona tells the protagonist that it's not possible to restart the game, because that game was created as an exact copy of what happens in real life, and well, real life doesn't have a reset button. Another thing we find out here is that the game the waifu sold to the kid is one from 10 years ago that had been banned for being dangerous. In fact, very few real people dare to play it in Japan, and the waifu informs the kid that one of them is a guy named Jinji who also killed his best friend starting the game. So she advises the protagonist to look for him to see how he managed to play after that first unfortunate event. But before going to find Jinji, the waifu tells the kid kid that they should go buy clothes to change his appearance a bit, considering that he's now being hunted by the police for killing Martine. This is how he sneaks away without being seen and manages to buy a robe to cover his face. After this, the kid and the fairy go to look for Gingy, who according to Riona spends his time in a casino. During the journey, the protagonist encounters Alicia, who of course wants to kill him to avenge her brother. Faced with Alicia's stabbing attempts, the kid has no choice but to run away. After a while of escaping, the kid managed to get to safety. There he notices that his rating has changed. He's now a best friend killer runner. In that situation, the kid says he's tired and tries to save the game and leave because he has to go to school. However, the save screen doesn't appear, and Riona says that happens because the game doesn't allow disconnecting in the middle of a battle. And indeed, Alicia is still there causing a commotion. She even sliced the kid's hand, and she would have killed him if Riona hadn't intervened in his defense. There, the kid managed to escape enough to disconnect from the game. Back in reality, he notices that his hand is fine, but despite that, his heart rate is accelerated because he experienced all the emotions of the game in his real body. Although nothing, the scare is over for the protagonist. Now he must live his real life. He went to school, met his friend whom he told about being scammed with a game from 10 years ago. He also saw the bullies waiting to make fun of him, and then he returned home. At that moment, his sister knocks on the door asking him not to play again because the day before she was screaming all night because of that game. But nothing, the kid doesn't listen because since his real life is very boring, he decides to return to the game. Upon resuming it, he realizes that he's in the same situation as when he left, hidden and with a wounded hand. There, he meets a fat guy who turns out to be Gingy. He heals his hand and takes him to the casino. There, the protagonist tells him that he also killed his best friend, so he wants Gingy to give him advice. But no, Gingy tells him that he didn't do anything special, that in fact, he has been a failure during the game. However, he says he knows the story of someone who managed to complete the game. This guy managed to reach the city of Flora and complete all the missions. This person is called Kamui and was rated as the Eternal Invincible, the adventurer never surpassed, and folks, that title is good enough for a manga. After this, Gingy tells him that his current rating is that of a heartless human, and true to his title, he discovers the protagonist and calls the police to betray him. Chapter 3. So right there, the cops show up to arrest the kid. He tries to escape, but Gingy himself prevents it, telling the protagonist that if he behaves well, they might give him parole, which is what he has, and well, now he cooperates with the cops so they won't lock him up again. During the kid's transfer to prison, the locals started stoning him. Then our protagonist remembers that upon entering the game, the host called him a hero and gave him the mission to defeat the Demon Lord. So, well, the kid asks the cop to release him, on the grounds that he is a hero and must fulfill a mission. But no, the policeman doesn't believe a word of it. Then the kid notices that Alicia is nearby, so he asks the cop to take him quickly to jail. And yes, officer, better in jail than pelted. While locked up, the kid tries to leave the game. However, it informs him that he cannot leave while in an event, and apparently his imprisonment is considered an event. That's how several hours go by and the kid still hasn't gotten out. Then he realizes that the game is so realistic that his character got hungry and needed to pee. When he thinks about doing the latter, Martin's ghost appears. He begins to torment Yuki. He reproaches him for killing him. The kid says it was an accident, and well, Martin accepts it. What he doesn't accept is that the kid forgot the promise he made at the Kanura tree. Obviously, the protagonist doesn't know what promise or what tree Martin is referring to. The kid thinks that maybe that event happened before he joined the game, so well, since the kid doesn't remember such a promise, Martin says he will continue to appear in Yuki's life until he remembers. So, facing Martin's harassment, the protagonist starts asking for help. That's why a waifu named Mizurisa enters the scene, who takes the kid out of his cell and takes him to a separate room where the game informs him that Mizurisa wants to celebrate an adult event with him. Facing this situation, the protagonist understands that the waifu wants to do the deed with him, so he accepts the event. There, Mizurisa asks him to lie down. The kid is imagining the best, but it turns out that the waifu wants to torture him, not erotically, but spiritually. She tells him that she wants to cut off some limbs for him to confess his crime. So, the kid shows fear and starts screaming. This makes Riona appear, but well, the fairy isn't much help either, as she tells him that he must endure the torture in order to be released from prison. So, while they're about to cut his leg, the kid pees himself, and after a while, the cop with the pink nose shows up to ask Mizurisa to stop, as orders from his superior came to release the kid. Then, the kid's rating changed, and Riona congratulates him since she says that thanks to the P command, he managed to avoid charges. But no, the kid didn't like anything that just happened, not being locked up, not having ghosts show up to intimidate him, not being tried to be tortured, and certainly not being made to wet his pants. So extremely upset, he decides to quit the game and swears he'll never play it again. Chapter 4. Back in the real world, he realizes he didn't urinate and decides to go back to what he used to do before becoming addicted to games, running. The kid, before becoming a gaming maniac, was an athlete, so now he seeks to resume that lifestyle by joining races at his school. While preparing, he encounters a former famous runner, a man who has even won Olympic medals. And yes, this legend tells the kid that he sees a lot of potential in him, so he encourages him to do his best in the race. Now, because he was talking to this man, the kid forgot to go to the bathroom, so when the race starts, he feels the urge to go, but well, there's no time for that now. Having started the race, the protagonist gives his best, but he had the misfortune of tripping, and not only that, but when he fell, he ended up urinating on the track. Naturally, this caused him tremendous public embarrassment. The poor kid was ridiculed in front of the entire school. Even the Olympic medalist went to the bathroom to mock him. The next day, the protagonist is very sad. He doesn't even feel hungry. He says he will quit racing just like he quit the game he was playing, but when his sister hears this, she gets upset. She tells him that he is someone who gives up too easily because although she didn't like him playing the game that made him scream, she is bothered by the fact that the kid always runs away from things at the first obstacle, which is a clear sign of weakness. Back at school, the protagonist is unwilling to live. He gives his money to the bullies even before they ask for it, and in general, he doesn't pay attention to the people around him. So after a while, he goes to the store angrily to tell Riona that he wants to sell the game. The waifu doesn't want to accept it, but the upset protagonist reminds her of all the reasons why he has decided to quit the game. However, instead of accepting the game, Riona tries to convince him not to abandon it. With this in mind, she shows him an interview of Kamui. I don't know if you remember him. He's the guy Jinji said was the only one able to complete the game. Well, this guy turns out to be very successful in real life now, and he said in the interview that the game the protagonist is playing helped him acquire the temperament necessary to succeed in life. In addition to this interview, the waifu shows the protagonist a guide made by Kamui himself, where he gives some tricks to beat the game. And yes, despite Kamui making this guide, he's the only one to beat the game because nobody reads the guide completely. The reason nobody reads the guide completely is that during it, Kamui gives instructions very arrogantly, insulting every 2 words, and well, this made nobody endure until the end. Despite his reluctance and squirming every time he was insulted, the protagonist began to look at the guide. There, he understands some things he did wrong during the game. However, he still says he won't play again. But then, the waifu hugs him and says that if he manages to complete the game, she will marry him. People, this waifu is a serial manipulator. With this, the waifu was able to convince the protagonist to return, so we see him back with his pants wet and in the same dungeon. There they inform him that the captain of the guard wants to talk to him. Chapter 5. That's how they take him to where the captain is, named Tesla. He asks the protagonist to sit down, despite still wearing pee-soaked pants, and even offers him food. The protagonist finds so much kindness unreal, so he asks Tesla why he called him. Tesla says the reason for the invitation is to apologize, as after further investigation, he realized that Martin's death was an accident. Upon hearing this from the captain, the protagonist is glad that there's someone fair in that game, so he starts eating like a savage. Then Tesla tells him to be careful of Alicia, as it's obvious the girl holds a grudge against him. So he offers to help him if he ever finds himself in trouble. After this, the protagonist leaves prison happy that things are finally going well for him. However, not everything is as it seems, as some villagers still hold a grudge against him for Martin's death. So even though the police are no longer after him, the protagonist still has to flee from ordinary people because otherwise they'll slash his face. Later, Riona advises the kid to buy some smoke bombs so he can escape from his attackers, but the kid is more broke than I am when YouTube withholds my payments, so he asks the waifu how to make money in that game. Riona tells him that since that game is an imitation of real life, money is obtained in the same way by working, borrowing, or stealing. But since the protagonist doesn't want more trouble with the law, he decides to start looking for a job, and since the common people hate him because they consider him Martin's killer, he had to look for a job in a clandestine office. In this office, they still treat him like a murderer, but at least they offer him available jobs for ex-convicts. Among some, the protagonist decides to take one that says do what Brian asks you for an hour, because the protagonist doesn't plan to work much either. He just wants enough to buy the smoke bombs. However, the old lady hands him a whip and informs him that what Brian wants is for him to be whipped while naked, so this job is really creepy. Understanding this, the protagonist says he won't take it, and since the lady only has such jobs to offer, she ends up kicking the protagonist out of the office for being a complainer. Now the only option the kid has to get money is to borrow it, so they went to visit the only person who can have money in that world. Yes, people, they went to ask the trader Jinji for money. Their Jinji starts mocking the kid for wetting himself, and as the kid responds with insults, Jinji decides not to lend him money while responding to the kid's insults by calling him wet. And since the kid was already upset, now that he knows he has nothing to lose, he decides to go hand to hand against Jinji. There they both hit each other hard, sword. At one point, the kid wants to smash the fat guy's face, but Martin's ghost appears to ask him not to kill more people. So there, the fat guy, seeing that the kid is terrified of seeing his friend's ghost, tells him he'll have to get used to it because no matter how much time passes, those ghosts don't leave, because he says he still sees his friend's ghost too. Having this in common, they both stop fighting, make peace, and there the fairy tells the fat guy that since he couldn't defeat the protagonist, now he'll have to give him his coins. This wasn't part of the plan, but well, the important thing is that the fairy could solve it. For that reason, the protagonist's rating is updated and now he is a friend-killing friend stealer. The protagonist doesn't like this at all since it was Rihanna who took the coins, but well, he has no choice but to accept his reality. After a while, they went to a store to buy the smoke bombs, but since the protagonist is still marked in the game's society, they charged him extra for the bombs, so he could only get 2. After this, he went to the house where the game started to look for a sword that the protagonist initially didn't see, but he could find out where it was thanks to Kamui's guide. The detail is that when he finds it, he also meets Alicia. Faced with this, the protagonist throws one of the smoke bombs, but since the idiot didn't light the fuse, it didn't explode. And of course, there's no way the protagonist can get fire to light the other one he has, so everything seems to indicate that the kid will be slashed. However, someone enters the room. The protagonist thinks it's Tesla, but no, it's Mizurisa. Chapter 6. The redhead tells Alicia that she won't allow her to harm her beloved Moja Camus, and folks, that nickname is good. Additionally, she says that Tesla ordered her to protect the kid, and since she has a great sense of smell, she was able to track the protagonist due to the smell of his urine. But well, despite Mizurisa's sermon, Alicia decided to attack, saying she will kill the protagonist, and if Mizurisa gets in the way, she'll kill her too. However, Mizurisa isn't very keen on being killed, so she swings a sword at Alicia. The problem is that Alicia has Chucky's powers. She suddenly appeared on the ceiling and, after descending, insists on fighting. There, Mizurisa decides to confess the truth about why she's saving the protagonist. The story about being sent by Tesla is a lie. She tells us that the real reason she's saving the kid is that she wants to torture him again because she enjoyed the previous torture. Wait, what? Yes, folks, the poor kid is trapped in a room with 2 crazies. In the end, Alicia knocks out Mizurisa, thus winning the crazy fight. Now, she threatens to kill the protagonist, but then Yuki remembers the advice from the guide, where they told him that fighting against his childhood friend wouldn't work, so he should try to win without fighting. To this, the protagonist comes up with the idea of touching her breasts. Yes, folks, the protagonist gambled on groping his ex-friend's chest, but it didn't work. Alicia kicked him in the groin, and to make matters worse, Martin appears, telling him to let himself be killed so he can accompany him in the other world. It seems that the protagonist will get a good stab, but right there, remembering another piece of advice from the guide, the protagonist decides to tell Alicia that he loves her. This miraculously made her stop her murderous instincts. She also began to confess that she loves the protagonist too, but doesn't forgive him for killing her brother, who also loved him, and for fleeing the way he did without trying to save him. Finally, Alicia decides to go cry in her room, and the protagonist reflects on what the waifu just said, because although for him it's just a game, they considered them their friends. For this reason, the protagonist grabs the sword he went to get and goes to the Kanura tree. There he tries to contact Martin. When he appears, he apologizes for killing him and asks him to accompany him on his journey through the game. As he shakes his hand, he is transported to Martin's memories, where he can see that the promise they made was to be best friends forever. Saying these words back in the present, Martin begins to disappear because he said he would be with the protagonist until he remembered the promise, and since he did, Martin says goodbye even though the protagonist wanted him to stay. After this, the protagonist feels a little sad, and there we see his rating updated. He is now the best killer of best friends. But folks, there's no time for that now because both the fairy and the protagonist have realized that the city has started to catch fire. Chapter 7. Upon seeing this, Yuki approached to gather information, but people were more focused on fleeing than talking. It wasn't until he went to see a fearless blacksmith that he found out that the fires were caused by goblins. There, taking advantage of being in a blacksmith shop, the protagonist starts to remove rust from his sword. However, there comes a moment when he gets tired because he hears the screams of the people, so he says he will go to save them. The problem is that Riona doesn't let him go out because she says the protagonist is still very weak and, well, if he dies in the game, something terrible will happen to him in real life. The waifu didn't say what, but the kid is thinking that if he dies in the game, he will also die in real life, but no, the waifu clarifies that that is not what will happen to him. She says that what will happen to him if he dies in the game is that his console will also die. So she suggests to the protagonist to save the progress and go out to see the guide, because there they could find some way to defeat the goblins. The protagonist says he will, but that before he would like to see a goblin since he is curious. There, when he looks out, he sees one. The detail is that he also sees that it is about to kill a girl, so he tries to go out to help her. However, Riona doesn't let him because if he does, not only will the girl die, but also him. Then after a moral debate, they realize that the guards arrive to save the girl, but nothing. The goblin easily beats them all. Seeing this, the protagonist understands that the goblins are indeed strong, so he asks if any player has been able to defeat them. The fairy tells him that only two, Kamui and Sho. We already know Kamui, and Sho is a guy who became a boxer after playing the game. One day they asked him who was the strongest opponent he faced in his career, and he said the goblins in the game. Haha, those goblins are almost broken. Well, the protagonist's chances are very low, but he still insists that he will save the girl, so since the fairy doesn't want the kid to die, she says she will distract the goblin so he can rescue the girl. And folks, the plan was going well for them. The problem is that another goblin appeared to block the protagonist's exit. In that situation, the kid decided to be bait so the girl could escape, but the goblins ignored him and went after the girl. Then when the girl's death was imminent, the protagonist suddenly experienced a super speed buff and, well, by the grace of the Holy Spirit, he was able to rescue the girl. Yuki doesn't understand how he was able to run so fast, but the truth is that he knows he won't do it again, but relax because to save the day Tesla arrived. This Tesla is really overpowered because with a single burst, he split the goblins in two. After this, Tesla offers the protagonist to work for him as a warrior, to which the protagonist accepts without hesitation because he knows that with Tesla around, he will be protected, and also with his training, he can become stronger. There, the protagonist takes advantage of the good moment to disconnect from the game and return to his life. In it, he goes to school, talks for a while with his friend, but since his real life is boring, he decides to go back home to play, although before that, he takes a look at the guide. There, Kamui says that there are 3 ways to leave the city to complete the missions. The first is to fight with allies to recruit them and form your own exploration army. This option has a success rate of 5%. The second way is to hide from the goblins for 4 days by digging a hole, and then after that, clear the path. This option has a success rate of 10%. And the third way is to join Tesla's army, but folks, Kamui says that this is the worst option of all, as the success rate is only 0.1%. Chapter 8. Naturally, upon hearing this, the kid is disappointed because that was the option he chose, although, well, not all is lost because Kamui says that those who hold the title of best friend killer have a higher chance. Instead of 0.1%, it becomes 0.5%. And folks, isn't that a lot? So, after receiving some advice from Kamui about what he should do to opt for that 0.5% chance, he decides to return to the game. There, Tesla takes him to meet Queen Govern, who embraces him excitingly, asking him to protect the city. Then, they took him to the training camp where Kamui warned him that he had to survive for 5 days because the training is really exhausting. There, after a patriotic speech from Tesla, he leaves and leaves Bob, a guard, in charge. Bob says that before starting the training, he needs the newcomers to change, so he leads the protagonist to his dorm to do so and then takes them to the instructor, who turns out to be the cop with the pink nose. And since this cop already has a negative opinion of the kid, he makes him fight against him in training. The only good thing is that the swords are made of wood, so they didn't pierce the protagonist. However, the instructor beat him up and humiliated him in front of the other recruits, who began to say that the protagonist is very weak. So later, when it was time to eat, nobody wanted to sit with him. The next day, the second day of training begins, and they make the protagonist wield the sword alone. While doing so, 2 other recruits approach to make fun of him. The big guy is named Granada, and the blonde one is Paulu. Besides mocking him, Granada threatens him to leave the army since he is very weak and compromises the group's strength. But then, a waifu who is also a recruit calls him aside to help him with gripping the sword. The problem is that on the 3rd day of training, the practices began, and the protagonist was paired with the strongest in the group, who turns out to be Granada. Naturally, Granada easily defeated him, and after doing so, he reiterates to the protagonist that he should withdraw from the army for his own good, and if he doesn't, he'll have to pay him and his friend to protect them. This makes the kid remember the bullies from his school whom he pays, and concludes that his life doesn't change even in a video game. Chapter 9. And of course, now the protagonist is sad because he doesn't even have money to pay the army guys for protection. Faced with this, the fairy tells the protagonist that for situations like these, the army has an advisory office. So when he goes there, he tells the officer that the instructors don't pay attention to him, his classmates make fun of him, and they are even extorting him. Upon hearing all this, the advisor decides to counsel the protagonist by telling him that he should just quit the army, as that would end all his problems. After this, Yuki leaves the office feeling quite upset as they didn't help him at all. Then Kathy appears to tell the protagonist that if he has problems, the best thing is to go pray. And since the guy doesn't have many options, he decides to do so. There, the religious supervisor says she will give the protagonist a spiritual cleansing. And folks, the cleansing was literal. They gave the guy a full bath. with this, we move on to the 4th day of training, but nothing has changed. The guy still gets beaten up, the army bullies ask him for money, and when the protagonist says he doesn't have any, the blonde guy decides to beat him up. Seeing this, Kathy went to call the instructor, but of course, the instructor didn't do much, he didn't even reprimand the bullies. Then the bullies decide to ask the guy if Kathy is his friend. He says yes, but the bullies express that if Kathy is his friend, they will treat her the same way they treat him. So they ask Kathy herself about her friendship with the guy, and of course, to avoid beatings, she denies it, denying the friendship she has with the protagonist, which made everyone laugh, even the fairy. Although, well, the protagonist doesn't blame Kathy for denying the friendship because if she hadn't done it, they would have beaten her up too. There, the fairy tries to cheer up the protagonist, telling him that there's only 1 day left until the end of training, and she promises to help him. The guy asks how she'll do it, but she says she'll use her blessed powers in his favor. So we come to the 5th day, and we see that strange events started happening, obviously caused by the fairy. Suddenly, the big guy's boots appear in the drain, his sword gets lost, and after a while of searching, they found it in a stable full of manure. Faced with this, the big guy tries to blame the protagonist, but Bob says it's impossible for him to have done it since he hasn't left the barracks. Then the army nurse arrives saying she lost her panties, and when they check the big guy's belongings, they realize he has them. This made the nurse accuse him of theft. The big guy defends himself, saying he's not a thief and says he has no need to take clothes from such an ugly old lady. But after the alleged theft and the insult to the nurse, he made enemies with all his comrades, including the blonde guy, so now the big guy was alone just like the protagonist, but unlike the protagonist, Granada couldn't take it, so he ended up resigning. So shortly after, we see the pink-nosed guy announcing Granada's retirement, but then Tesla arrives with a letter supposedly written by the blonde guy, stating that the instructor was responsible for making Granada resign. Obviously, neither the blonde guy knows where that letter came from, nor does the instructor know why they're questioning him, so amidst the confusion, Tesla decides to ask the recruits if they think the pink-nosed guy is fit to be an instructor. And it's there when Kathy says no, since once he allowed the blonde guy and Granada to attack the protagonist and did nothing about it. And after Kathy, everyone started rebelling against the army's Rudolph, so they ended up firing him. And of course, all this was the work of the fairy, who took care of all the protagonist's enemies to free his 5th day of training. But well, the protagonist isn't very happy since he thinks the fairy went too far, and besides, he says he's still as weak as ever, so tomorrow, when he has to fight against the goblins, they'll surely turn him into pulp. Then, the fairy decides to confess to the protagonist the real reason why she wants the game to end. Chapter 10. 10 years ago, she met Kamui in the game, fell in love with him, and asked him to marry her. But he rejected her, saying she had cow-like breasts. From that moment, Riona swore to get revenge on Kamui by finding someone else to beat the game, marrying that person, and proving to Kamui that despite her cow-like breasts, she could marry someone who finished the game. So, this waifu's motivation is quite odd. Later, the kid went to the rooftop to watch for the arrival of the goblins, where he encounters Tesla, who begins to give a speech as if he were going to die. Since the protagonist doesn't know what to do next, he decides to exit the game to read the guide. Upon doing so, he finds out that his sister was watching him very closely, and the waifu says she thought her brother was dead because she had been calling for a long time and he didn't answer. After this, the kid goes to the important part, checking the guide to know what to do next. There, Kamui gives him a trick to face the arrival of the goblins, and with this, the protagonist returns to the game. There, Tesla is giving the attack speech and also announces that 2 new members will join the army to replace the blonde and Granada, and yes, folks, look who the 2 waifus are, the crazy Alicia and the crazy Mizurisa. Anyway, there's nothing the protagonist can do to prevent the girls from joining the army, so ignoring this, we move on to the part where Tesla orders the protagonist to team up with both waifus. So we see the 4 of them, including the fairy, heading to the assigned mission. Then they witness a thief stealing a wallet from an innocent woman, so Alicia cuts off his hand along with the wallet. The protagonist went to return the wallet, but the owner didn't like that it had a hand attached, so she faints. Meanwhile, Mizurisa is interrogating the thief, who confesses that he, like many other thieves, was hired by someone to steal in the city at the same time. He also tells them that the head of the thieves is at the casino, so the kid and his girls went to defeat him. At the casino, they realize that the boss is the bald guy there, so while the waifus take care of him and his escorts, the protagonist frees the hostages, including Jinji. But it's all a trap. Jinji wasn't a hostage, he was an accomplice. He took advantage of the distraction to take the protagonist hostage, meaning Jinji never made peace with the protagonist, it was all a deception. Realizing this, the protagonist breaks free and asks to let him fight Jinji alone, as it's a pending matter he wants to settle. But in the end, seeing that these 2 are terrible at fighting, Alicia decided to intervene in favor of the protagonist. After this, all the thieves were arrested, and Jinji confesses that this was his plan because in prison he won't be prey to the goblins goblins, and besides, he'll get 3 meals a day. So this fat guy has very low life aspirations. After they were taken to prison, the goblins started arriving in the city, and then the protagonist felt like going to the bathroom where he encountered one of the goblins. Chapter 11. Fortunately, Mizurisa, who is obsessed with the protagonist's urine, decided to follow him to the bathroom, and when she saw the goblin, she was able to decapitate it. She took the opportunity to torture him a little, but then Alicia appeared, complaining that the protagonist and Mizurisa were alone. After this, the waifus started arguing, and the protagonist went to look for Tesla. However, on the way, he still felt the need to go to the bathroom since he couldn't do it before due to the goblin. There, the fairy and the protagonist debated for a while about the protagonist's needs, and after this unnecessary conversation, they continued on their way to Tesla. When they arrived, they realized that Tesla and the entire army were about to get into a fight against the goblin army. So, the protagonist arrived just in time to join the party, but not only him, but also Mizurisa and Alicia, who unlike the protagonist, proved useful in the fight against the little goblins. After some time of fighting, Kathy and Bob arrived to inform Tesla that the south gate, which leads to the Queen's castle, had been breached, so well, Tesla went there immediately, and there he finds none other than the King of the Goblins. Seeing him, the protagonist understands that because they had to face him, that's why that method of leaving the city had only a 0.1% chance of success. Since not even Tesla could defeat him in a previous fight, the only thing he could do was injure his eye and escape. And well, now the Goblin King wants revenge against the guy who left him with one eye, so the fight is going to be good. Tesla asks the protagonist to help him, but before that, Mizurisa arrives to tell him that she will fight in his place. And Alicia says the same. Mizurisa was quickly blown away, but Alicia was able to help a little more, and after a while, Tesla was able to seriously injure the Goblin King. However, the protagonist remembers what Kamui said in the guide, so thinking that the battle was too easy, he says that surely something else is coming. And folks, that something else that remained to be revealed is that Tesla is the villain of the story, since both he and the Queen confess to manipulating the goblins to keep the population captive. Chapter 12. Of course, the protagonist is aware that he can't even handle a little goblin, let alone the strongest character in the game, so he closes his eyes to await his death. However, right there, he realizes that Alicia decided to take the hit for him. The protagonist doesn't understand why she protected him if she wanted to kill him, but the waifu said that Martin appeared to her in a dream and told her that the protagonist wasn't at fault, so she decided to forgive him and protect him. With Alicia's death, the protagonist managed to get serious, awakening his hidden power of super speed, managing to dodge Tesla's next attack. And there, we learn that the trick Kamui gave the protagonist to pass that part of the game is that since the game seeks to emulate what happens in real life, there's nothing more powerful than the will not to give up. So, the advice was to use it to his advantage, even if circumstances were adverse for him. For this reason, we see the motivated protagonist fighting against Tesla, and folks, that will not to give up is bringing quite a bit of power to the kid. Just look at how he moves now. It seems he will win, but in one of his attacks, his sword breaks. Now Tesla has him in a bad spot to split him in two. And when we see what will happen, the story takes us to a memory between the kid and Martin. The kid thinks he's dead, so that's why he's speaking through Martin. But no, due to a script twist, Martin has now become part of the protagonist's sword, so thanks to that, he could avoid his death. But not only that, he also managed to break Tesla's sword, although it doesn't matter because Tesla has two swords. So, unsheathing the second one, he threatens to use his most powerful technique. The protagonist also says he will do the same. But in the end, the Queen intervened and they killed the protagonist. Yes, folks, very sad all around. So, we see him disappointed in his bed, talking on the phone with Riona and remembering the moment when the console exploded. But Riona, acknowledging the potential shown by the protagonist, tells him she will give him another game and another console so he can try again. But no, the protagonist is not very convinced to do so since he doesn't want to start from the beginning. Then he went to check the guide, and Kamui mocks the protagonist for losing because after all, the survival odds were very low. However, he gives him a trick to go back to the game an hour before his death. With this, the kid tells Riona that he will receive the console since with the hack Kamui gave him, he can go back an hour before his death, which coincides with Alicia's death, so he could also avoid hers. However, Riona says she doesn't think it's a good idea because Tesla might still kill him again. The odds of passing that part of the game are still very low. Understanding this, the protagonist decides to train in his real life for a month to improve, not to run away, to strengthen his will not to give up so that when he returns to the game, that will is much stronger. During that month, the kid increased his confidence level, he could even defend himself against the bullies and they stopped bothering him. When the time came, the protagonist went to a park to wait for Riona to bring him the new console with the game. There he had a little conversation in his mind with Kamui, to whom he says that since he knows the trick to restart the game, that that means he also lost, only he didn't give up. Kamui doesn't admit this, but he tells the protagonist that he will teach him how to become successful when he reconnects. After a while, Riona arrives with the console and the kid goes home ready to beat that 0.5% chance, but before he can do it, the series ends. It can't be. Obviously, we all want a second part, even me, the secondary voice, but it won't come if you don't comment and like the video. So it's up to you folks. Comment the word console and give lots of likes to the video so that the second part of the summary arrives soon.